Because at the end of the day, the reality is if they have to move James Harden for essentially pieces that are forward facing or expiring contracts, right? They are probably not going to contend this year. And thus, even if you get a max player in the offseason, you are probably not going to contend next year either while you build up that continuity that you need in order to compete for a title long term. So I wonder if Joel would see this as not just wasting 2023-24, but also potentially wasting 2024-25 while building up that necessary kind of team structure that you need in order to win, and thus potentially wasting the two best remaining years of his career by James essentially asking out and not going out and getting another star for him in this 2023-24 season.
It is certainly a reasonable interpretation, though not the only one. There have been a lot of teams in recent vintage that have come together quickly enough. You do go the Celtics with Ray Allen and KG and Paul Pierce. The Warriors with Durant are such an anomaly because that team was arguably the most talented in NBA history. So it's like, yeah, they could give you like they're not their best punch and still win. But it does happen. I mean, Miami absolutely could have won the title in their first year as well. So, but the idea of them not being the best version, I think that's completely fair because especially in this iteration, like even if you take the like they get a really good max player, they're going to be taking this down not all the way to the studs, but pretty close. Like, and so it's going to take a little bit to, so you're going to need some minimum players to hit, you're going to need the room exception to be a wonderful player if we're going into this scenario, ideally somebody who's probably going to have to close games for you in that season. And so it could work, but you're right that it is a difficult thing. And the sales pitch for Embiid, it's like, well, with James Harden wanting his way out, then we're going to do that. Now, of course, an important part of this is one of the reasons James Harden presumably wants his way out is that the Sixers were reluctant to give him longer term money. That's why this framing is so important, is the idea that not that I think James Harden was the savior there necessarily. I mean, I've never been, this version of James Harden I don't think does that. But they could have had him in the fold. It seems to me that this was not inevitable. It just became inevitable based on the decisions that people have made, even if those decisions were justified and may end up being proven correct, which they very well could. And I actually kind of expect that they will.
So I say all of this to say, I think there are two pathways three. You laid out the first one, which is they trade James for cap space, basically, right? The problem with that idea is the cap space idea is essentially to go get one of like Kawhi, Paul George, or somebody like that. Right, like they're very.
I can run through. So what I would say would be like kind of quote unquote top five. We won't count LeBron in this, though. Technically, LeBron could be a free agent next year. We don't know. But the five that I've kind of fixated on for them are as like kind of arguably max level players, whether or not they sign that as an actual contract. Kawhi, Paul George, Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, and former Sixers Jrue Holiday. And one of the challenges is 3 of those 5 are on teams that have high hopes for this year. Like you could make an argument that their best case scenario is better than the Sixers' realistic best case scenario. And then Siakam and OG Anunoby are complicated for a variety of reasons, but we don't know that they're going to hit free agency. Like it could be that they sign an extension, or it could be like they get traded somewhere else and that team then, sets their ducks in a row, incidentally, like the Sixers did years ago with Tobias Harris. Like the circumstance where they never truly hit the open market. And so I like a lot of those guys with Embiid and Maxey, if we think of that as the foundation. Like, for example, Siakam, fellow Cameroonian, the defense would be really interesting. I don't love all the spacing stuff. But Anunoby, like one of the best one-on-one defenders in the league, he has explored the studio space a lot offensively, and incidentally, the coach who let him do that, Nick Nurse, is now the coach in Philly. But I think he'd be a wonderful fit, kind of the version of him on paper, and also Anunoby's young enough that we could still see his best years, as opposed to, most guys who hit unrestricted free agency are in their 30s, and that's just not what we're going to see. And then there's also there's the offshoot path, which is like you get 2 non-max guys to take a little less, and that group could include something like Miles Bridges or like the aforementioned Gordon Hayward, or nobody in the world has any idea what Klay Thompson's situation is. But like you could concoct a thing where you get 2 pretty good players and that are willing to come on board, and maybe you could even do a wink and a nod, and you can give them a little bit more in a couple of years. But that's the cap space path for a free agent. There's also the offshoot of trading for somebody, but the challenge there is if you're trading for somebody better than those like top 5 guys I was talking about, that team is going to want assets. You're not going to, unless it's Bradley Beal with his no trade clause, you're not going to be able to get much of those players for basically nothing, or or even like what the Sixers have to offer.
So my problem with the free agency path is I think you are basically limiting yourself if you want to stay as a title contender. I don't, as much as I love OG Anunoby, and I do, a team with Tyrese Maxey, OG Anunoby, Joel Embiid, and like very little else does not win a title.
I agree.
I don't think it does. I feel the same about Drew Holiday, to be honest. I don't think that team wins a title. The guys that I think you can reasonably make a case for is if Paul George is still 100% healthy and gets through a whole playoffs. Kawhi Leonard, if he's 100% healthy, gets through playoffs, and LeBron. Like I think LeBron is an interesting case at the very least.
I'll add in
what LeBron wants.
I'll add in there's an interesting, I don't fully support it, argument for Siakam, in the sense that one of the elements of Siakam's offensive game is that he's done a lot of like stuff on the ball, and suddenly with Nick Nurse as his coach. And there might be a more efficient version of him playing alongside 2 offensive players who are better than he is. And I mean, Siakam, and the defensive case is pretty obvious for him. I'm not persuaded by it necessarily, but I do think that there is an argument that a max, like Pascal Siakam taking a half step back on offense and a half step forward on defense, is a nasty complementary player alongside Embiid specifically.
I'm intrigued by that concept. I would want to get in contact with Pascal Siakam's representation now and like see what his opinions are on Nick Nurse and see what his opinions are on Joel and like understand a little bit more about that. I'm not saying tampering. I'm saying
And Sam, that's the funniest thing is that 3 of the 5 guys that we're talking about have experience with Nick Nurse, because of course Kawhi does as well. So their thoughts on this could be very salient.
And I think that is an intriguing potential pathway. The second pathway is combining Tyrese Maxey and Tobias Harris to go out and try and get a star that could be available now, right? You could try and go out and get Pascal Siakam. You can't really do that, I don't think, because if you do that, I think you are basically limiting yourself at that point in terms of ceiling. Because if you're going out and you're getting Pascal Siakam, you could theoretically do that in the offseason this year in the pathway that you said, right? There are very few other stars that are actually available right now and that actually work with Embiid. Like you might be able to go out and get like somebody like Karl Anthony Towns, and I wouldn't go out and say that I would move Tyrese Maxey for Karl Towns. I personally would not do that. I'm just saying, like, if you're trying to build a second star around Joel Embiid, a theoretical pathway is using the Maxey asset, using the Tobias Harris expiring contract, combining those two and trying to go out and get a star. Is there anybody that you can look at as a theoretical option that makes sense there?
No, there isn't anybody that really stands out to me. The best, a lot of the like top 20 players in the league aren't really available. And I mean, or they're in circumstances where their team is happy with them, or they're available but aren't necessarily a great fit. Like is there a case for like Damian Lillard? Yeah, maybe, but like he's paid a lot of money during this time, and it doesn't seem like he wants to be there. And you could think about something like that, but also like if let's say you're doing it for Lillard, like your timeline gets a little bit thorny here. It's like you got, as much as I love Dame and he's been wonderful when he's been healthy, like if he ages like any sort of normal human being, you got a couple of years probably, and you're paying him for a lot more than those 2 because of the extension he signed. And so that's risky too. Like it's a risky proposition. And the other part is like, to me, if you're trading Maxey, part of the logic there is you want to get somebody who either is like a true 1 or 1A, or who is young enough that you could see something else. Like to me, getting a 38 or 30, not 38, like a 33-year-old star with that, well, then you're kind of in a similar boat. Like you're trading Maxey, you're mortgaging the future. It doesn't have to be as extreme as how badly the Rudy Gobert trade worked out, because very few things ever do. But because generally speaking, like Jaylen Browns don't become available every day, and that's the way it kind of works.
There is one theoretical player out there that I think you can make this case for. And by the way, this strategy then would include moving James Harden essentially for expiring players that are a little bit more like, you could do the Clippers trade at that point for their expiring veterans at this point.
Sure.
There's one player that I think you can make even the smallest logical sense for this.
Okay.
For. And
I'm interested.
And it would involve, you'd have to add multiple picks to do this as well. Trae Young. Because I think if you're Atlanta, you can make a case that Tyrese Maxey is a, potentially interesting fit with DeJounte Murray. And the Tobias Harris deal allows you to cut some money in some respect, right? And it seems like Atlanta in some way is like cost conscious, right? It also gives you like a slightly more flexible outcome here in terms of if you acquire picks as well. That's the only name that I can even make the smallest amount of sense for. I think Atlanta would have better offers for Trae Young if they decided to go down this road of moving Trae Young, and I'm not advocating them moving Trae Young. I'm just trying to even come up with the slightest theoretical outcome here that you could make a case for.
Trae's compelling, to be sure. And I mean, I think that at times his star around the league has actually been a little underappreciated, just because, he is a player who, when you put him on a team, generally they're going to have a consistently strong offense. And like, he's done that. Now, they were hurt last year by having significantly worse spacing. That's what happens when you give up some of your best shooters, or they're hurt, which happened for them as well. Yeah. But it is like, the idea that Young can propel the offense, and Trae Young's off-ball game at times is underappreciated. Now, putting him off-ball alongside DeJounte Murray isn't quite the same thing as doing so alongside Joel Embiid, because Joel Embiid, he occupies a different space on the floor. He occupies the defense in a very different way. But the other part of that, if I were in Daryl Morey's shoes, is where does that put you, and like also the salary structure there, because you're punting on max space, because Trae Young makes a lot of money right now, and Trae Young, he is a very talented player, but he has specific flaws in the playoffs. He's a very limited defender, and the idea that part of what you love about Joel Embiid is that he can occupy a larger offensive role than every center that isn't named Nikola Jokic, and he can do that. Well, then you don't need an on-ball dynamo necessarily in the same sense, though I generally believe the more good on-ball players you have, the better you're going to be if they can shoot, which Trae generally can. And so I think that there is a logic to it, but as you said, I think that the other challenge of that negotiation is in part because of where Philly stands. It's hard to have the best offer, because unless they left Tyrese Maxey, and in that case, then like maybe there's a case that Landry Fields, and more importantly, because these are ownership level decisions primarily, ownership is like, oh, maybe we can thread the needle here, maybe we can not be as bad, we can do that, and Atlanta's out a couple of their own future firsts because of the DeJounte deal, so there is a benefit to them of staying relevant. So maybe I don't, but again, like we talked about this in terms of the cap space route, and there's going to be a theme here. I don't think that, to me, Trae and Joel, especially if it's a limited supporting cast, that is good enough to get you all the way there.
So the only reason I say maybe to that is that in terms of that being an idea, is that I think you can make the case that it's very similar to what Daryl Morey was trying to do with James Harden.
Sure.
Having this dominant pick and roll playmaking guard next to Joel Embiid. Again, I don't really think it makes a lot of sense for Atlanta. I'm just coming up with like the only name that I can theoretically think that could hit the market that could make even like the smallest amount of sense. The final pathway here to me is attaching picks to Harden to try and get somebody else. And Zach Hoke in the YouTube comments brings up the idea of trying to do Harden and multiple firsts for somebody like Zach LaVine. Getting somebody like LaVine plus multiple firsts might allow you to then re-sign Maxey, use the Tobias Harris expiring to go out and maybe get like some bad money on your roster that could actually have like good players, but bad money that are like slightly overpaid. And then you have a core of Maxey, LaVine, using the expiring Harris money to take on some longer term money to maybe go about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a possibility there too. And LaVine, his ability to play kind of on ball and off ball. Basically, the idea is, can you get somebody who is better than the players that you could potentially use cap space on, acknowledging that like getting Zach LaVine is a certainty. He is on your roster. He is under contract. Whereas any one of the players we're talking about, not only is it uncertain whether they are even going to hit the market, but much less whether they will actually choose you over everyone else, including their current team. And so there is, and the idea that you can be more viable in the near term. Because like the idea is that Zach LaVine will be better for you than whatever iteration of James Harden you would expect to get. Yeah. So yeah, I do think that there's merit to that. And that's the other part of the approach with the Sixers that has been so dangerous, is that like not only is it that Harden is in a different place, but one of the underappreciated parts of their offseason is like they let some valued contributors go for reasonable contracts. Shake Milton is now on the Timberwolves. George Niang is on the Cavs. And it's not like those guys broke the bank. It's not a Bruce Brown situation where like, hey, you player helped you win a championship. He signed for way more money than you could offer. Congratulations, move on. It was in part probably weird with Milton because he had his non-guaranteed second year. The idea that they didn't want these sorts of commitments. If they had gone down this route from the beginning, then they could have theoretically, they could have done that pivot, and like they could have done that even by doing a Clippers trade earlier, and then you reroute some of the stuff and everything else. But yeah, I think that there's some merit to that. The challenge with those deals, and I'm not saying this is a bad idea. I appreciate Zach for bringing it up. Is a lot of the teams in that boat don't think they're in that boat. Like Chicago is the fantastic example. It's like, would Chicago be in a better situation if they traded Zach LaVine for expiring contracts, especially if they could get some first-round picks that had some real sizzle? I think yes. But I'm not Arturis. And Arturis, their general manager, who built this team and who believes that this team could still be good, I think it's more likely that they extend DeMar DeRozan at a high wage than that they trade Zach LaVine. And he is entrusted to do that by ownership and everything else. And so you're looking for like it's not that you're looking for a needle in a haystack. They're like Zach LaVine is a very good player. Like these are established commodities and everything else. Mm-hmm. It's you're looking for a player who is simultaneously available and someone who is interested in buying what you are selling. And that basically means that they're looking to cash out and sell and transition into a different direction.
Yeah. No, I think that's right.
It's a great question, though.
And that is why if a deal like that was to happen, you would have to do this, I think, by holding on to Harden for the first 30-ish games of the season, probably, and holding your nose and praying that this doesn't become a disaster. And that feels kind of dangerous to me personally.
Sure.
And that's why this whole thing is interesting to me, because James, I think, is going to be pretty tough to be around, given what his current inclination seems to be. We've talked a lot about Philly, and there's still one final question here that I think we need to ask at the end of the day. Let's say this goes as badly as it could. And I think that there's a real chance it could go this badly. That results in Joel Embiid asking out, right? Like this, we're now officially on like Joel Embiid watch, in my opinion. I understand that Sixers fans, like, that sucks, but it is obvious. Like, we are 100% on Joel Embiid watch. If this Harden thing goes very poorly, this is like potentially the first step of Joel Embiid being very frustrated with the organization. And I'm not saying that from inside information. I'm saying that just in terms of logic, that feels fair, right?
It does. And if it provides some solace to Phillies fans, we were on Giannis Antetokounmpo watch until we weren't. Like this can be a circumstance where the player just, no drama, re-ups, or that the team kind of it resolves in the other way of like, okay, this all kind of fit together. It does not mean in any way, shape, or form that player is gone. It's a done deal, whether it's through free agency or a trade or whatever. Yeah. But the history of modern NBA basketball is that high-level players do not tolerate being on teams without championship viability for very long. Like that is the way it works. Now, it could be a circumstance where, the team, the seas change and they kind of think that they could turn around, or there's a sudden injury or something else. Like, yeah, that can happen for sure. But it is generally the way these things work. And so that is real pressure. That is pressure for Daryl Morey. That is pressure for ownership to not only being willing to embrace whatever approach, but also being willing to spend should that approach, whatever that ends up being. Because remember that you have this narrow window. Let's say they do the cap space route. You need Harris or whoever is owning the Sixers at that point to be willing to kind of use those middle years to build up the roster and eventually pay like probably second tax level when Joel Embiid gets into his next contract. And, but for Embiid, I mean, there is no requirement. And what I always say in these circumstances, just like in free agency, is like players, all they can do is be honest with themselves and what they want to do. And if they want to stay where they are, more power to them. If they want to go somewhere else, more power to them there. So it is a very, it is the most common thing to happen there should it go poorly. And that does not mean it is definite. That does not mean the die is cast, but it does mean it's a serious possibility. And that might be another consideration you brought up, the idea of with Maxey. And I don't think Daryl Morey wants to tear this down. I don't think anyone really does at this moment in time.
I don't think so either.
But let's say Tyrese Maxey justifiably comes at this from the perspective of like, hey, like I've been a very good player. Like you can look at what some of the other, and you could argue, and I would, that he's better than some of the Pools and Heroes of the world.
Yep.
Like the kind of extension that he would accept is a little bit close. Let's say theoretically, I don't have any inside information on this, to what he could get in free agency. Well, then as the Sixers, you're you're sacrificing a lot signing him now, because you're getting that, and because you lose this cap space idea, and you hope that they never turn into a pumpkin, but recent past shows that they can. And so,
at least in terms of trade value,
right? And so the idea is that from the perspective of, if you need to change course, whether that's changing because things go really well or changing because things go really poorly, not having Maxey locked in makes a lot of sense. And there's also the risk, and one of the things you and I haven't talked about is going back to one of the highest profile free agents that the Sixers could get in 24 is Kawhi Leonard. One of the rumored reasons that his relationship soured with the Spurs was their reluctance, or let's say refusal in the endgame, to give him that extension. They played this game and, they got LaMarcus Aldridge out of it. It's not like they, struck out or anything else, but, you lose that security and everything else. And so there is no guarantee, again, that this will happen with them. Like Andre Drummond stayed happily on the Pistons after they did a similar thing. It can happen. But the idea, like I generally think like no drama extensions, I've become more amenable to them recently, because it's just like, you don't want to cause all this stuff if you have a general idea. But the idea of a high level team having cap space and like it, and if Maxey's willing to take like 10 million less than his maximum, of course, then you consider that and you just roll with it and you do everything else. But yeah, it's a fair consideration.
I think that the way that we just explained this, I think kind of crystallizes, in my opinion, how Philly should go about this. If I was Philly, the first thing I would be doing would be exploring the James Harden plus first round picks market. Because even if you move James Harden and you move out those future first round picks, and this goes completely fucking haywire, and you end up having to move Joel, you're going to recoup a lot of those firsts anyway by moving Joel Embiid. Right? That seems fair?
And you put, one other challenge for Philly. This came up a little bit in my piece. It's hard for them to trade firsts right now because of the ones that they already have owed, but they can do some, like we're using first as a proxy for assets. Like there are other things they could do.
Yeah. Like they have, I believe, their own 2024. They owe out their 2025. They owe out a current 2027 that likely will be a 2027 because the 2025 they owe out is only like top 4 protected or something. So the reason I say all of this is to say they could still move their 2029 pick. They could move a bunch of pick swaps if they want to. I would be trying to do that. I would be trying to move out that plus Harden for a better player or like a top 50-ish player in the league. That's the way I would go about this. And then hoping that player is on an expiring contract in some way, shape, or form. Honestly, like I would do like James Harden and a first probably for DeMar DeRozan. That seems kind of wild on its face, but I feel like that allows you to contend now. It allows you to have potential flexibility in the offseason to go out and try and get a Kawhi Leonard or a DeMar DeRozan or Paul George. And if they don't resign, you can still pay DeMar more than anybody else can. Mm-hmm. And you might have a chance at retaining him.